At in 28 minutes, one of the things which we focus on is to keep our courses hands-on as much as possible. Before we discuss any theory about Spring Boot and Chess, we would start with a small example of Spring Boot. What we'll do is, during the first couple of steps, we would set up and launch a Spring Boot application. We'll use Maven and Eclipse. And during step 2, we'll also create our first REST controller. Once we do that, we would have an application which we can use to discuss all about Spring Boot magic. We will look at more about Spring Boot startup projects. We would understand what Spring Boot startup parent is and how Spring Boot compares with Spring. So we would start up with a couple of hands-on steps, and then we would move into understanding all that you need to know theoretically about Spring Boot. Does that sound like a plan? Let's get started with step 1 now. In this step, we will set up and launch a Spring Boot application with Maven and Eclipse. All details about step 1 are in this file, step1.md. github.com/in28minutes Spring Boot for beginners. This is the page, and if you go further down, you have a step1.md. If you open that app, you see all the details about what we would be doing during this step. Basically, what we would be doing is setting up a Spring Boot project. So what we would be doing is we would be setting up a Maven project with Eclipse. That's very easy. If you want to use IDE like IntelliJ, the link for how to do that is here. After that, we would include all the dependencies that are needed for Spring Boot. If you don't understand the terms dependency, that's not a problem. We'll look at it as well. And then we would launch your first Spring Boot application. Let's get started with setting up a Maven project with Eclipse. When you launch up Eclipse for the first time, it would ask you for a workspace. Workspace is basically a folder where all the files belonging to your project are stored. Select some folder on your hard disk as a workspace folder and click OK. And then you would end up at a page like this. This is basically the starter page for Eclipse Java IDE. One of the most important things is you need to make sure that you have a Java EE IDE. You can close this, and let's get started with creating our first Maven project. So the way you would create a Maven project is file and say new. We would want to create a Maven project. So file, new Maven project. And we would want to create a very simple project. So because this is one of your first Maven projects, I would choose creating a simple project without really selecting a Maven archetype. You can use the default workspace location so that it stores the project details in the same folder as the workspace. You can click next. To start off, we would need to give a name to our project. So the group ID and artifact ID are basically the way you'd give a name to your projects. Just like you'd give a package name and a class name to every class that you create, similar to that, any Maven artifact that you would create needs to have a group ID and an artifact ID. I'll use com in 28 minutes Spring Boot as the group ID, and because this is your first Spring Boot project, I'll just call it first Spring Boot project as the artifact ID. I'll leave the version as snapshot and the packaging as jar, and all the other stuff I can leave it as it is, and I can go ahead and click the finish button. So this would basically create a Maven project, and you'd see Eclipse would open that project up. When the project is first created, you'd see all these folders in the Project Explorer. Project Explorer is on the left, and this shows you all the files in your project. So what we have is a folder called source main Java, source main resources, source test Java, and source test resources. All of these are empty for now. And you have a file called pom.xml. Pom.xml is basically the configuration for Maven. So POM stands for Project Object Model, and this is where we define all the dependencies of our project. Source main Java is the folder where you would have your source code, and source test Java would be where you have your unit tests or your integration tests. When you open up the pom.xml, this is what you would see. So this is basically a simple XML. The most important things for us are group ID. That's exactly what we entered. Com in 28 minutes, Spring Boot, artifact ID, and the version. These are exactly as we entered them. That's cool. You might ask a question. Why do I need Maven? As we know, Java web applications, typically we would use a number of jar files. These are typically called dependencies. For example, because this is a Spring project, I might need Spring jar. Probably I'll be using logging, so I need logging log4j.jar or some other SLF for j.jar or some logging jar. Before Maven, the way we used to do that was to download that jar manually and put it in our project workspace. Maven offers a better way of doing that called dependency management. For example, let's say I want to I want to include Spring Core jar in this particular project. All that I need to do is find out what is the dependency name for Spring Core. So for example, if you search for Maven dependency, Spring Framework, one of the results which comes up is Spring Core. So I just click that. I want to use the 4.3.5 release. And over here is the dependency name for Spring Core. So I would copy that and I would include it in here. So I'm basically, what I'm doing is I'm including the dependency. Before we include the dependency, we need to create the dependencies section. So let's go ahead and do that. Dependencies, and there we go. So that's cool. The things you can see is that the group ID and the artifact ID identify this specific thing, and we are trying to get a specific release. So you can have multiple versions of this specific jar. So Spring Core, you would have a lot of versions. We are trying to get one of the latest 4.x versions, 4.3.5 release. I'm not really saved it in yet. So if you look at the Maven dependencies, there is nothing in here right now. So the Maven dependencies is right now empty. So now I'm doing a Control S save, and you can see the Maven dependency on Spring Core comes in. Also, you'd see that commons logging is brought in because Spring Core needs common logging. So Spring Core uses commons logging. So commons logging is a transitive dependency for us. So because we use Spring Core and Spring Core needs commons logging, it gets it in. So that's the reason why we use Maven in this specific project, as well as, Maven is kind of the most used build tool. We looked at one of the advantages of Maven, which is dependency management. There are a lot of stuff that Maven helps us with. We'll look at all that stuff a little later. For now, let's focus on creating our first Spring Boot application. We would want to launch and run it in Tomcat. There are 5 steps, actually there are 5 total steps launching an application with Spring Boot. One of the first ones is to add a Spring Boot startup parent. So over here, if you look at it, we are specifying a release. So we are saying 4.3.5.release. One of the great things about startup parent is it manages the dependency versions for everything. So once we include the Spring Boot startup parent in, we don't need to specify the version anymore. That's one of the advantages of Spring Boot startup parent. So we'll start with including that, and then we would include the Spring Boot startup web. One of the things with typical projects before Spring Boot is that if I need to develop a web application, let's say, there are a lot of things, a lot of jars I would need. Let's say I'm using Spring MVC without using Spring Boot, then I would need to include a lot of dependencies manually to get all the functionality working. Spring Boot, all that you need is to include Spring Boot starter web. So this Spring Boot starter web would bring in all the stuff that are needed to develop a web application. We'll look at how to do that. The other thing is we want to use Java version 8. So we'll configure that. And also we would create a Spring Boot plugin. The Spring Boot plugin would help us to launch the Spring Boot application. The last one is to create the Java file, which is called the application launcher. Those are the 5 steps which are involved.